projects together. I have a website here. It's part of a case study in one of the textbooks. You may or may not have seen this, but I've used this as a good starting point. This would be something that might be similar to a midterm project or the final project. It's the workings of a functional website. And so if you've been working in CodePen or you've been getting the basics of HTML, CSS, and even JavaScript, this really illustrates how it all comes together. It can be a lot to take in. It can be a little bit confusing. So hopefully we're going to talk about the creating your web directory and how you work your file and folder structure. I'm going to show how to link to external files, both for CSS and JavaScript. We will talk a little bit about semantic elements and how you start organizing your content. So things like device screen readers can crawl and navigate through your website and properly know what kind of content it is, know how to read it out to somebody if they have a visual impairment. That also gives valid standard compliant code that boosts your SEO or search engine optimization to help make sure that your website returns as valid and that it's more apt to return at the top of that search results page than something with invalid code. I'll do a little bit of demonstration using the developer tools. I'll give a little bit of a JavaScript overview at the end. We've got some examples on here that show some interactivity. You see this button at the bottom of the page that shows and hides content. We actually also have a little bit of jQuery being used here in JavaScript that pulls in the last date that any particular file or this particular page, our index.html page, when it was last modified, that's on every page. And then we have, when I hover over this particular anchor tag or hyperlink on the page, we get this little alert message saying there's a 10% discount. So those are examples of JavaScript. We'll show you how to work with that. I'll show you how to create a template using Visual Studio Code. I will also show you talk about the CSS background image property. So really this is helpful regardless of what class you're in, regardless of what assignment. When you're working on something that needs to be a functional website, we'll talk about all the important things to pull everything together. So let's talk about file structure and folder structure. It's very important. We're working with local files, and so we have to have a folder to act as our root web directory. So in this case, you can see my file explorer is open. I have this web folder. It's called Java Jam. It's just a regular folder. If I were to right click and hit new, you can create a folder. But inside that is all of the workings, all the assets, all the images, all of the CSS style links, all the JavaScript files. Everything is in here working as one unit. And so that's where that directory or that folder structure becomes super important. So you just want to remember on the name of your web directory that you don't have any spaces. And then you'll notice when we click inside the web directory that everything's lowercase, no spaces. Once you start working with multiple HTML pages and multiple images or videos, when you start having external style sheets and maybe some scripts written in JavaScript, we need to be organized in our structure using additional subdirectories. So you're going to start seeing some of your assignments as we progress. You're going to see requirements change. So in this case, this would be what you might see for a midterm or a final or even a website assignment where you need to create these subfolders for your style sheet. And in this case, that's in the CSS folder. If we click in there, you'll see the JavaJam .css file, which really normally those are called style or style sheets. But in this case, if we're working with more than one project or different things or different areas on our project, I should say, you might see additional style sheets, but most of what you're going to be doing will have one style sheet. We also have this JS and this media folder. If we click in the JS folder, this is the scripts file. So that's a JavaScript file, so scripts.js. If we look in the media folder, we have all of the images except for the favicon. And the favicon goes, depending on where you're at in the course or what chapter or what project, a favicon is what displays in the browser tab. If you see my cursor at the top left, there is not currently one displaying for this, but that is where you'll see, you see here on the CodePen, you can see their little icon there. So that's what's a favicon if you're not familiar. But you can see when we look at this, it's important to keep these files organized so that it's not just all thrown here together and you're having to scroll up and down to try to find where things are. But you have to be aware that once that file structure changes, that you just have to use that in your link. So if we're linking to pages, or we're linking to an image that might be in a subdirectory, or we're linking to a style sheet, we have to do that properly using what's called relative links. And when we say relative, it's everything is relative to the position of any particular asset, file, image that you're pointing to, as to where it is in compared to our root top level structure. So all of our HTML files here are in the root directory. So when we look at we're going to switch over to Visual Studio Code here, and there's 4 different pages here, but I'm going to click on the index page, and I'm going to come up here to our navigation that's between line 18 and line 26. And I see a little problem with the indentation on the code here. We want to make sure that anything nested inside is tabbed over 1 to the right. And I'll show you a little trick with moving our code around. If I select all of this code in Visual Studio Code, and I hold my control key down, and if I hit the left bracket, both for the curly bracket and the square brackets, it's the same key. If I go to the left, it's going to decrease the indent, but if I go to the right, it's going to increase it. So we can kind of tab it around, but since this is an unordered list that I've highlighted, it goes from line 19 to 25. We have an unordered list with what's called list items inside. And so those list items are tabbed over 1 to the right from the unordered list. But since the unordered list is nested inside of our navigation, it needs to be tabbed over 1 to the right from the navigation. So that's really how you properly organize things by their structure. But this gives us great examples of how we're linking. We're using this href attribute to link to a particular page, and that's how navigation works. We're linking to a page, and the reason that we don't have to include any directory, subdirectory name, if we look at our structure over here, these files are in our root directory, so we can simply list them by name. But if we go to link to something like our style sheet, it is no longer in the root directory. It is 1 level deep into a CSS subdirectory. So if we come up and we look, this is the next example that I'm showing. You should remember, depending upon where you're at in your journey, that this is a standards compliant HTML web page. And so we have a few important pieces here. This may be a refresher for you, or you may have this down, but in line 1, you see the doc type. That is important to tell our browser that this is an HTML5 document. We then have the HTML tag. That's what's referred to often as the root element. And that doesn't end. If we look until all the way down at the bottom of the page, on line 64 here, we have the ending HTML tag. That wraps the 2 other main pieces to our website. We see the ending body tag here just above it. If we go clear to the top, right below the HTML, we have the head and then we have the body. Those are the 2 pieces. The head element, not to be confused with a header element or a heading element, right? Just think of it as a person's body. You have the head and you have their body, right? A skeleton. We have the head and then we have what we could refer to as the rest of the body. And so the head contains links to external file sheets. We have on line 9 a link to what's called a CDN for the jQuery, which is a library for JavaScript. And some of my examples include the JavaScript written in jQuery. So we're tapping into some functionality and resources that come with that library. But on line 8, we have a very important link here. Well, actually, it's on line 7. If I take this out, I'm going to show you just kind of how we did this. But on line 7, this is where you need to link to that external CSS style sheet. So if I click on the Java Jam, and we come up here, which actually, let me erase some of this code here. I was doing some preparation for this example, so I'm going to make this as simple as possible. Okay. I'm just going to delete all of that. But these are all of our CSS declarations, and it's in this javajam.css file. So if you are working in something like CodePen, and I have an example of CodePen up here. This is just This is used in one of my courses to illustrate what's called CSS Grid, and we won't really focus on that for this lesson. So I'm going to kind of scroll down below all the CSS Grid styles and keep going. I've got a couple methods to do that, but you can see all of your CSS declarations here. And if you remember for the HTML portion, again, my code has a lot of different semantic elements, which are what you want to start using as you progress with your projects. So we can come in here and I could just type an H4 element, which says header element here where my cursor is. I could start typing that and we'd see it on the page, but it really wouldn't have any structure. We put it in a header element, but not to be confused with the head element that we just looked at, but this is that main portion on our web page up here at the very top, the header. If we're looking at the anatomy of our web page, we generally have a footer at the bottom. We have a header at the top, which in this case, it has an image that we'll look at. We have our navigation that is a vertical navigation as opposed to a horizontal that might go from left to right. But we add that structure, we add those semantic elements in there to tell our browser what type of content this is. Because again, it's not just a user that might have good eyesight looking at our website from the front end. The machine, the browser's also reading our code on the back end. And if something like a device screen reader for somebody with a visual impairment was crawling through our website, we need to have structure to that content. So an example of structure in this case, we can see that I have an article element here where my cursor is at the top left. And then we have a heading and we have a paragraph and then that article ends. And then we start an aside element that opens up on line 14 here, and then it contains a heading and a paragraph element, and then it ends on line 17. So these items are the heading and the paragraph, which you can see that on the page down here at the bottom right. So all of these names here that I've used headings for to kind of show the anatomy of a web page shows this header in the light blue. Then we have a main element, and that is what establishes our main content for the page. And so we want to use that main element as a semantic element to identify this as the top priority of content. We have an image up here, but really what we want if we click on over to the home page, it's the same thing here. We want to make sure that in this example, this is called a header image with the road and the trees, a hero image, excuse me. We don't want that to just be what the user sees. We want to make sure that they can read our main content. And so those are some of the semantic elements that we can start adding on our pages. But all of that, what you actually see on the page is contained within the body element. So with the example that we were looking at, we had the head element up top with our meta tags. We have links to our style sheet. We have links to our JavaScript. But then we start our body tag that again has that header, our navigation, our main element. And again, you may not be creating a page that's quite this developed yet, but this is where we start seeing how everything works together. So that was the HTML. And I want to show you real quickly, you'll see this circle up here. That means I have unsaved changes. But that first step of creating your web directory, when you come into your File Explorer, you right click and you hit new and you create that folder, the first thing that you want to do is come in here to the file and you want to open it up as that folder. And as soon as you do that, you will see, when you very first create your web directory, you're not going to have anything in here, but then you're going to start creating these files, okay? And these are examples of files that have already been created, but I want to show you how you can use some built-in functions of Visual Studio Code in most text editors. If I hit new file here, we know that our home page is always called the index.html, but I'm just going to create an examples page. So examples.html, and then we can use this, you get a blank slate, okay? And so Visual Studio Code has a autofill feature. If you start typing exclamation, you can see there's either the single or the triple, and if you click on the single, it gives you the skeleton of a web template, and that's really where you can see a lot less code. It's a little less confusing here, here than it is when we start looking at a full page that has all the code, but it's really this simple to where all your CSS is going to go, all of your HTML elements that you want to see on your page are going to go within the body element. Up here, we want to link to that style sheet, and I'm going to go ahead and do that here. I'm going to start typing link. And then the REL equals style sheet just identifies that as a, this is the style sheet for the web page. And then of course we have to use our subdirectory and then the name of the file, and I can save that. And then if I were to pull in content from, let's say, the CodePen example, we know that if you've been using CodePen, you know that we have 3 different screens here. We have HTML, we have CSS, and we have JavaScript. So I could come in here, and I know that I don't need the body element because I already have that on my page, but I could pull this header all the way down to the footer. I could copy this. I could come over to my text editor, and now this content is ready to put right inside the body element. So I now have, which I can see, again, this is, some of this needs to just be tightened up on the indentation. I can use my control and brackets just to make sure that that's good. But I have the header, and then I have a main element, again, with an article and an aside element. So the article, if we look on the page here, is this main article, and then this darker blue color, that's the aside element, but they're both within our main content because they really are. If we were to look at this, I'm going to come up here in CodePen, and I'm going to hold my control key down because I want it to open in a new window, but I can click on this little icon to the right of settings, and I can go to full page mode, and we can see how the full page looks. And this is a great example by color where you can kind of see the different areas on our page and how we want to start structuring that with our HTML. So if you've just been doing, you know, basic paragraphs and basic headings, now start thinking about how you can use semantic elements, element names with meaning that can be used to add in that additional structure. So let's talk about our CSS then. So we saw how we link to it. We saw how we can pull our HTML out of CodePen. These are all of our CSS selectors and our CSS declarations. So we start with the selector, and then we have our opening and closing brackets, and then we have all of the different CSS properties and different values that we can get it. And so with each project, with each assignment, with each, if you have a textbook, with each textbook chapter, you learn new methods to use and different ways to target those. But really, all we have to do if we're putting our web page together is to go over to our style sheet and add those in here. And it becomes, you can see in this particular project that we have 4 different pages, and they're all using the same style sheet. So it becomes important that you start organizing your content by global styles first. And by global styles, I mean what can be applied to each page. So part of what you'll be developing in your project is good web design practices. You want to have some consistency in your colors. You want to establish some kind of branding or theme to your website. You can see we kind of have 2 different colors of brown and this kind of light yellow color. We have consistency we have a little bit of red as an accent color here. But if we go to each individual page, those are global styles because they can apply easily to every single page. And when you do that, you don't have to be specific to that page. You can write the selector for the body one time. You can see we're establishing the background color, the text color, the font family, and a little bit of spacing, and then also a maximum width here. And that's going to apply to the body on every single page. So you don't have to write that 4 different times. And that's really where some of your coding efficiency comes in. But you are going to have times where you need specific styles to go to specific pages. And so I've added in some code here for, which I haven't written it yet, but if we go over to our examples page, and we came up here to the body element, and we wanted to give this page a special ID. We can just start typing ID. Remember that with IDs, there's only one with that name on the page. So I'm going to identify this as the example page. So it's going to make sense that I name my ID example. This is trying to bring up some IntelliSense, but don't listen to that. We want all of our code to be in lowercase. So now that I've given this page a special ID to the body, if I want it to be, and remember, if you have a circle up here, it means you have unsaved changes. So I'm going to hit Control S to save my changes. Now I can go over to that, to the CSS, and I can use that as a hook. Okay, and I'm going to use the header as an example. We have 2 different ways here. We have the body here on line 17, and then we have the header on line 24. I have other examples down here, but if we just look at the header with this example for this light blue color, I have included that ID name in my selector, which is saying, hey, any header that's on a page that has the ID of example, there's a space between the two, that's how you'd write that selector. Now, since the example ID has been given to the body element, you do not include a space. That's the only time that you don't include a space, because we're not doing it by the relationship, we're doing it because it's the actual element that has that ID applied to it. If we go back over to our examples page and you look at the header, it doesn't have the ID, but it's on the page with it's nested inside the element that has the ID example. So that's where that space comes in. Two different examples there. So we're going to save that. We're going to go over to back to the Java Jam file. We're going to make sure that we save that. And then when we go over, I don't have that examples page linked anywhere on my page. I could quickly go into which actually, let's do that. I'm going to show you two different ways. We could just pull up this page, right? We see it's now in our structure. If I double clicked on that, you can see that I have my Chrome tab flashing at me here. That is the examples page that I just created. Now, if I wanted to go over to Visual Studio Code and go back to one of my pages, if I go to my home page here, I have my navigation. I could simply come down here and add another list item and another anchor tag, and we could do examples. And my IntelliSense is kicking in, so I can just click on that. And now we want to make sure whatever we want to display in our navigation, we want to type that between the opening and closing anchor brackets. So now if I go back over to my website, and remember we just added it to the home page, so if I click on any one of these other pages, it disappears because I haven't added it to the navigation, but now it's here. And if I click on that, that is added. And you'll notice that when we go back over to the home page, that none of those blue styles are being pulled in because I've been specific with my ID here. When I wrote my HTML, or excuse me, my CSS selector, I included that ID in it, so it's not going to target just any header on the website, It's going to just target the ones on that particular page. So that's a good example of how you can be more specific with your CSS. But let's say something was going on with this page. I'm gonna use this page as an example. Let's say I have this brown and this blue, and I thought that it shouldn't be doing this. I didn't want to mix all the colors together. I can either hit F12, or I can right click on the page and hit inspect. But this brings up my developer tools, and you can kind of pull this up as much as you want. You kind of want it where you can see it. You want to make sure you're selected on elements over here, and you'll have the styles on the right. It's always the H. When you do elements, you're always going to get the styles on the right. And we can use these developer tools to start inspecting something. If I thought that this header element up here, this heading within the header element shouldn't be brown, I could kind of search around. I can click around in here on within the HTML code itself, or I can use this little inspector tool here and hover over and click on it. And when we do, we can see what's going on over here. We get the styles as to what's going on. This is called a media query, so that comes in later lessons usually, but we can keep going. We can see that this is an H4 element in our HTML, and so we can look over here and we can actually see what line it's on in our code. This is being brought up in the browser, but it's referencing the code that we're writing in our text editor. So if we see on line 94, we see right here where my cursor is on the right. If we click back over to Visual Studio Code and we go within our CSS style sheet, we can scroll down and it should be on line 94. And sure enough, that is all of the CSS styles for the color, the background color, the font size, the padding. Remember that padding's the spacing inside of a margin. We have some text transform to make that heading all in uppercase. We have a border around the bottom, and then we actually clear that element, and I'm not going to go into that right now, but you can use this as an example to start seeing some of these different CSS property and property values. So as you're working through assignments, as you're reviewing articles, and you're seeing W3 schools, different examples, these are how these different properties work, and you want to be able to come in here, add your code, go back over, refresh your page. If we wanted to make sure that that H4, we could change the background color here, or we could come up, just remember that that's going to change it for all H4 elements on the page. If we wanted to be more specific and come back up here to where we added in that example ID, we could do something as simple as, and you want to generally put all of your code that's specific to a certain page together. So we can go and we can type in this ID, we can give it a space, and then that was an H4 element, and we can, let's just change the background color. Let's say red, and we can save it, and let's go over and refresh the page, and you can now see that they're red on this page only. If we go back and we refresh the home page, we don't see any of that red style coming in because we were specific in our CSS. So that's just kind of an example to show you how you can start working with multiple files together. But let's talk about the CSS. So if we come back over to CodePen, again, we can just pull any of those CSS declarations with those property and values, as long as we have it linked properly to each of our HTML pages up in the head element, we can add that in. So let's talk about, we've looked at the developer tools, we've talked about semantics to organize. Let's look at the JavaScript examples. And really in this case that I've added, I told you that the JavaScript, the scripts that I've written that are linked in this particular, on line 9, you'll see that instead of a link element, we use a script element. We have an opening script. We have nothing in between the two. There's nothing that we need to display on the page. We do need the ending script tag, but we just use the source attribute and we point to that script file. So it's in the CS directory, and then we name the file. So if we open up this directory on the left, we can look at that file. And all of this green are comments. So I'm going to close this Explorer. I'm going to try to get you to be able to see this as much as possible, but still kind of evaluate what's going on. So I have 3 different code blocks here with JavaScript that's using jQuery to do different things. And in this first one, this one really is where we see in the footer. It's pulling in, it's using a JavaScript or JavaScript and jQuery, and it's using this last modified here. And let's just go up and kind of evaluate line by line what's going on. It's if we look on the web page itself, and I'm going to click over here to show you, down in the footer, anytime we update something, and which I'm going to make a change on the index page real quick just to show you. I'm going to just back up, and I'm going to change that to example in the navigation. And if I click over here, currently it says it's in military time, so it's saying 5/20 on this date was the last time it was modified. But if I refresh the page, you can now see it's updated the time. So that's an interactive live functionality that's basically using jQuery, which is a JavaScript library, and we're using that last modified code there to pull this date in. And so let's look at it a little closer. So we have, again, 3 separate ones here. Don't get too confused by these notes here, but you can pause this and read what each line is doing. So let's look at line 1. We've got this $ document.ready, and then the function and an opening curly bracket. So the document is what refers to the document object. Okay, so we're working with programming. We have the document object, and then the $ is, that's the syntax for jQuery. That's the alias for the jQuery object. And then we have the document, and then the .ready, this is the jQuery method that waits for the document to be fully loaded. So the document .ready is, the code is not, this function is not going to execute until the document is fully ready and loaded. That's common practice. You'll see this in each example that we have here. And then we have an anonymous function, right? It's just an anonymous function, meaning it doesn't have a name here, but this function is going to execute when the document is ready. And then the next line, in line 2, we see again the $, that's the alias for the Java or the jQuery, and then we have this mod date. This is what is being targeted. Okay, so this is the mod date is the ID in our HTML, and I'll show you that shortly. But this is what really sets the HTML content. The .html here is what sets the content for what we see on the page. And this red between the single quotes is a string that gets attached to this last modified that we see here that actually uses that jQuery function. So you'll see that it's the method that's being bound there for, in these two last cases, we have what's called an event handler. So in this case, we'll see where we just saw the functionality of that, where it's being pulled, any page gets modified, it's going to be updated. The second one, let's look at this one. So this one is a mouse enter. This is the jQuery. The mouse enter is the jQuery method that binds the event handler, which in this case, it's the mouse enter event that's triggered when the mouse pointer enters the selected element. And in this case, we can see we have that same syntax starting with the $sign, and then between the single quotes here, we have the selector for what we're targeting. So let's go look at our on our menu page here. If we look for if we find the main element, our very first anchor tag that we have is on line 30. And you can see that we have the anchor or a tag, and we have an ID here that says sale alert. So let's go look at our JavaScript file. Which actually is this where's the sale alert? Main 8. So we are not targeting it by the sale alert. We are targeting it simply by the fact that it's an anchor tag within the main element. So it's going to do this on any page. And this mouse enter, we could also, you might see examples online where hover is used. The reason that I didn't use hover in this example is because the hover triggers two events, the mouse enter and the mouse exit. So it would display our alert message. You can see that this function includes an alert message, and it says Java Jam Mug Club members get a 10% discount on each coffee mug. So when this event is triggered, when the main element or the anchor tag in a main element is hovered over, or the mouse enters, I should say, this alert is going to pop up. So let's go look and see what that looks like. If we go over to our menu, you can see that in this paragraph here, we have this anchor tag. We know it's a hyperlink, an anchor tag that links to a hyperlink because it's underlined. And as soon as we mouse over it, that alert box comes up. So we see in this code where this is happening. We have the alert. You just have to pay special attention, and you're going to be finding your examples online. You're going to be working through different examples. But this is really just the code block that we add. We have it in an external JavaScript file. And then you can add little notes to yourself as to what's happening. So I told you that since we're using just a generic element selector here, every anchor tag with a main element, it's going to trigger the same thing. So I can click out of that, but let's go over to the music page. And if I look at the music page in the Visual Studio Code, I can kind of scan down and see that there's some anchor tags in here as well. But remember, because we used main, it would have to be within the main element. So let me find the main element. And if I click on the main element, you'll see that it puts a little orange box around it. And I can that's the ending main element, because I know it has the / in front of it. But I can scroll up and see where the beginning element is based on this little orange box that's around the main. So that's the opening and the closing. And so we can find any anchor tag within here and figure out which we can see one on line 32. You can see that these images on that page actually have hyperlinks around them. They're included in the image is actually here to the right. It's nested inside that anchor tag. But anytime that we hover over this, it's going to create the same effect. So let's test it out. We're on the music page. We have to look to make sure that we have our external JavaScript file properly linked. So on line 9, you can see that we're linked to it. Remember that on line 7 is what's called the CDN. That's what's linking to jQuery, which is a library of JavaScript. And since we're using that, we're pulling those functions and methods from that library. We have to have both of these links. And so if we click over to the page, and we hover over this image that we just found in the code, you can see that it triggers that alert, that function is evoked, and that alert comes up on the page because we mouse entered, it was the mouse enter that done that. So let's look at the very last one. So again, we're on that external JavaScript file. We have this one where it's targeting something by the ID, and we know on line 32, just as we saw in line 23, this was a element selector by name of the element, but here we have that hashtag, and when we're working with IDs, as we saw on the examples page, we put a hashtag in front of it. So it's the toggle button, and if I remember right, let me go and see where we put this one. Was this on the home page? Yes. So we should find this little button down here on our home page. And this one's hiding content. So we have two IDs here. So if we go over to our home page and we go down and we go to the bottom of the page, you can see the example on line 52, we have a button here. And nested within that button, or no, not nested, below the button, we have a div container that has a paragraph in it. And that div container, we can see has the ID for the hidden content. We can see that it has a style attribute where it's adding a style inline, which normally we would want this to be over in our CSS file. We could certainly move that over, especially since we have an ID here. We could just target this ID in our CSS, and we can change the style to display none. And actually I'm going to show you that. Let's go ahead and do that, because at this point, especially if you're doing your project, you don't want to have any inline style, okay? So I'm going to just select that. I'm going to do Control X, but now we have to be specific. We have to be specific with this hidden content ID, because we don't want to just apply that display hidden to a div element, because there's more than one div element within our website. So you're going to always want to put styles for specific page together, but I'm just going to come up here and make some room. And remember that the ID name was hidden dash content. So we need to include that ID to be specific, but then remember that it was a div element. And so we need to write this as a regular CSS declaration with the curly brackets, but then we can just copy that in, right? Which we need we don't use the style tag, right? We use the style property. This is the value. The style property is display, and then the value for that display is none. So the reason it was different colors and there were some squiggly lines, we got to take out that quotation mark. That was part of that attribute. But, and I'm going to come down here and just show you the difference, right? So when it's inline, we have this style equals quotation marks, display none. And that's what goes in our code over here if we had it inside of an HTML element. That's inline CSS. We don't want that. So we come over here and we go ahead and write out our selector with the ID. We write the element that we want to target, and then we put just the property and property value. So display none instead of you having to use that style attribute. So now when we push save, we come over to our index. It's no longer in here. We can hit save, and then we're going to refresh this page, and you can see that it still functions as it should. The initial, if we load our page, the initial should be hidden actually. So that is one thing here that you'll notice, that it is when the page is refreshed. If you don't hide it first, it is going to do that. So that would be an example of one that you want to go ahead and add your CSS style in. But oftentimes when you see CSS styles like that, you don't want to have it in line. But programming is one of those situations where you may want to have it. So we can actually delete this. And we're going to save that. We're going to go back to the index. We're going to put a little space. Remember, we're adding attributes, but before the closing bracket, I'm going to make sure that we add that back in there. We hit save, and now when we refresh the page, it's hidden by default. So again, still functions as it should with external CSS, except for the fact that it wouldn't load initially as hidden. So that's a problem. So that kind of shows you, though, how you can use your CSS externally, how you create your different HTML files, how you can use a template to get started with your HTML pages. One thing we need to look at we talked about having the different subdirectories. Let's talk about the background image or the different ways that we can add images to the page. So we have two graphics on the page. We have an image here that's acting as the hero image, and then we have this coffee mug here, or this coffee cup. And if we use our developer tools, I'm going to hit F12. I'm going to pull those developer tools up. I'm going to click on our little inspect tool, and I'm going to come up here and hover over this image here. And within this, we can see down here that in the HTML, it's selected this H1 element. Remember, that's the highest level, the largest heading element you can use. But we have a href value. That's actually for this Java Jam coffee bar. So sometimes when you inspect something, you can see that it's hovering over the image, the H1 element that spans the whole width of that header. So we're not actually inspecting the image. If you move a little lower, you can see that we're now inspecting the header, which is where that image is located. So if you're trying to find something, you may be in the vicinity of it, but not actually inspecting it. So I could either hover up here, or I could come down here and select on the header. But you'll notice on the right-hand side, once I do that, it's showing that we have a background image here. So if we look at the HTML, either here in our developer tools, but let's take it one step further and go over to our text editor. If we look up in the header, there is not an image or an IMG element used. We're not using our HTML to add that element. We're using CSS to add that element. And you can see it right here where my cursor is, that background image. We see that in line 262 on our CSS style sheet is where that code is. So let's go look at that for just a moment. I'm going to go back clear down to that isn't a media query. That's pulling it based on the size of my screen. If we actually look on line 77 here, we have that the code for the background image outside of that media query. So we can have it more than one place, and I really don't want to dive into all the examples for media queries here. I just want to show you a simple CSS example where you're adding the background image by this syntax. So you use the URL, and then within parentheses, you add the relative link to that image file. Now there's something a little different that you'll notice in this line of code. If I click on it here, you have a dot and a /. And the reason that we have to include that lies within the structure of your website. So if we go back to where we see the Java Jam, that's the highest level, that's the root directory, but the style sheet that we're writing this code on is not in our root directory. It actually lies within this subdirectory called CSS. And since everything on a relative link is related to the location of your root directory, you have to come up in your file, you have to come up in your path back to the root directory and then look for that image. So if we do, that // takes us back one level. So we're back in the root directory, but now we're looking for a resource, which is an image, that cup.jpg file. It's not in the root directory either. It is in a subfolder, and it's right here, cup. You can see it right there. So we have to include that again in our path. So if you're trying to use that background image property and it's not working, it generally means that you don't have the right path. Now I get some students that want to come in and include this whole path here. If you look at my address bar up here, you'll see that it's going to be an absolute link to my local files. And the problem with this is if you try to put that in as your href value in your anchor tag, it's specific to your local machine. It's going to work just fine on your machine, but once you zip up your folder and you send it to me, then it's not going to work on my machine. Not to mention that it would be really ugly to have to type out every time. If we look for our page navigation on any given page, you'd have to include all of that, type that out every single time, and it's not good. So just remember in your links to sometimes you have to go up a level if you're in your CSS file, sometimes you have to go down a level into a directory to find it, a file or an asset once you start working with multiple files, folders, images, those kind of things. So now the last thing that I really want to talk about in this video is just zipping up your file in case you didn't know how to do that. So you have your web directory, you right click it and you hit send to compressed folder. And when I do that, it zips everything up and that's how you attach it in Canvas. Okay? So if you recognize this file, this particular website, know that you have this resource in your textbook. If you don't have this resource in your textbook, that's fine too, but it's a good way, review this, pull this up. You can't pull this up unless you have the files, but pause this video where needed, look at the different code structures, the indentation, click on, make sure that your links are using the right syntax. When you click on your CSS, I'm going to kind of zoom out just a little bit. Start organizing your declarations by global styles first, and then break it down by page, and then by specific areas on a page. But you can kind of pause this video portion and look at the different CSS property and property values. But that really should give you everything that you need to kind of understand the workings of a website. So I hope this is helpful, but as always, if you have questions, reach out anytime.